Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this keynote address of the conference, Jews and Their Neighbors, 20th Century East and Central Europe in Times of War and Beyond. I'm Chavatiror Samuelson, and I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. If you've been with us over the years, whether in person or online, you know that Jewish Studies at ASU is a unique hybrid program that combines undergraduate and graduate instruction, as well as a robust program of public education, especially since the COVID pandemic of 2020, and it's still going on, unfortunately, in some ways. We have been offering numerous lectures and lecture series and research conferences via Zoom, and we have covered various aspects of Jewish history, the Jewish religion, and Jewish culture. Our online programs are attended by listeners literally all over the world. We have most people from the United States, but also for United Kingdom, Latin America, Europe, and of course, Israel. In these difficult days, when Israel is fighting for its future, we express our deep love of Israel and our unwavering support. We're very grateful to President Biden's moral clarity and heartfelt commitment to Israel's security. President Biden also reiterated his unwavering support of the Ukraine, which, like Israel, is struggling for its existence against an external threat. In Israel and in the Ukraine, President Biden noted that the United States has an ally that, and I'm quoting, is battling an enemy that wants to wipe it out of existence, unquote. Understanding the similarities and differences between Israel and the Ukraine requires historical awareness. Since we now live in the age of misinformation and disinformation, ASU Jewish Studies is especially committed to making accurate historical information and penetrating historical analysis accessible to the public. Understanding the complex processes and trends requires attention to nuance and rejection of simplistic explanations or superficial slogans. Accurate historical analysis requires historical preservation of documents, which is the goal of the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. I want to thank the leaders of the Jewish Historical Society, Dr. Lawrence Bell and Rabbi Jeffrey Chesnall, for cooperating and collaborating with ASU Jewish Studies over the years. I should say that during the last 15 years, we've held many lectures, historical exhibits, and other educational programs in this beautiful venue, and that has a very long history and very interesting history of Jewish presence here in Phoenix and in the Southwest. Historical consciousness and commitment to historical research will ensure that we will understand how the past always shapes the present and the future. So I would like to thank them, not here for me to thank them in person, but they will listen to this presentation and I'm sure that they appreciate that. So thank you, Larry and Jeffrey, for making Jewish history accessible to all. This lecture is the keynote address of a workshop that convenes historians from Europe and the United States who specialize in Central and Eastern Europe. The workshop is a tribute to the memory of our late and much beloved colleague, Professor Mark von Hagen, whose scholarship focused on the Ukraine, the region that will concern us this afternoon. So I now invite Professor Laurie Manchester to tell us about Professor Mark von Hagen and his important scholarship that inspired this workshop. She will also introduce our speaker, Professor Brian Horowitz of Tulane University. Professor Manchester.
Thank you very much, Hava. So yes, I am here, thank you, to tell you a little bit about Mark von Hagen. Mark von Hagen began his career at Columbia University, where he quickly rose through the ranks and became full professor and endowed chair and chair of the history department. He was also director of the Harriman Institute. He obtained his BA from Georgetown University, where he studied diplomacy, which we'll see later figures in his life, and then his graduate training at Stanford University. When the Soviet Union began to crumble, Mark was a specialist on the Red Army in the 1920s. But Mark understood that things were changing and that Russianists and Russian historians in particular had been overlooking some of the major issues that concerned the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And the main issue he became interested in were national minorities. And he chose the country of Ukraine, one the second largest of the republics of the Soviet Union after Russia, to focus on. He taught himself the Ukrainian language, knowing Polish and having the best Russian I have ever heard come from a non-native speaker. And his learning of the Ukrainian language earned him great praise in Ukraine, as well as did his unflagging sponsorship of Ukrainian scholarship and Ukrainian scholars. He was the first non-Ukrainian elected to be president of the International Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Now, this may, since we hear about Ukraine every day now, this may not seem like such a great achievement, but in 1995, Mark wrote a seminal article called "Does Ukraine Have a History?" And that was a question that a lot of Russianists disagreed with, that Ukraine didn't have a separate history from Russia. Things have changed, and by a large extent, they've changed because of Mark. One of the monographs he wrote, his second monograph, was on war in the borderlands, and it looked at Ukraine and the various areas around Ukraine and all of the ethnicities involved during World War I, very much like Jews and Their Neighbors, the conference that we are now holding. The book that he was working on, and parts of it are going to be published in Ukrainian, but while he was dying, and he died unfortunately early in 2019, was about Ukraine when it was its own country. For the first time, it was its own country since the medieval period and before 1991, and that was 1917 to 1920. And there too, he was looking at the Russian Civil War as it was affecting Ukraine, as Ukraine was fighting for independence, and how the various ethnicities and political parties in a very nuanced way were interacting with each other. When I told Mark's widower about this conference, he wrote me back and that he was so incredibly pleased because Mark, in his words, was all about bringing together people from different countries, people of different ethnicities, to get together and learn from one another. This conference would have been right up Mark's alley. And I also want to point out that he himself organized many conferences in various different nations and edited a number of very important he co-edited a number of important volumes. Coming back to and closing with his diplomacy, I want to note that after the terrible events of October 22nd, 2022, which have shaken those of us all over the world, it's shaken people, but shaken people who work on Russia and Ukraine. We think of Mark often, and we think how important it would be for him to be with us, to be in Washington, to be educating people about a region that is so little known, in part because Russianists ignored it for so long, just as Russia did. And I now turn to introduce Professor Brian Horowitz, who knew Mark von Hagen probably as well as I did. Brian is a professor of Jewish studies and Russian and German languages, because they put the two together despite World War II. At Tulane University, he has been chair of both departments and has also been director of Jewish studies. He is one of the most prominent Russian Jewish intellectual historians in the world. He has recently published, he's published a dozen actually a dozen, I counted, edited volumes and books, along with dozens of peer-reviewed articles and invited articles. But two of his monographs that I find particularly enlightening are his biography of Vladimir Jabotinsky, the great Zionist, and Brian focuses on his Russian years, and then his volume on Jewish philanthropy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Brian has been the recipient of numerous international fellowships, including the Alexander Humboldt Foundation in Germany. I think he had 2 Humboldts. He has been a Mellon Scholar, a Woodrow Wilson Scholar, and also had a fellowship at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And I'm like missing, like, I don't know, 90% of the ones that he's had. Those are just a few. And so when I think of Mark, I often think of Brian, because right after Mark died, I was asked by ASU to write a eulogy for Mark, which I did, and I posted online. And Brian was, I think, the first person who wrote me a condolence note. And he remarked in the condolence note that Mark was a real mensch. And that has always stood with me, and I've always been grateful to Brian for reaching out to me. So today, Brian is going to talk to us about varieties of Ukrainian Jewish intellectual thought in the 20th century.
Well, that's a very heartwarming, thank you, introduction. I want to say thank you very much to the Ron and Nympha Lowe family for this workshop and for this lecture. I also want to say thank you to Chava Tirosh Samuelson. Thank you, Chava, long friends. And to Anna Chichopek Giraj. It's easier in Cyrillic than it is in English. And so thank you for everyone. Thank you for the warm introduction, Maury. Okay, so let's get right into it. I find it impossible to define clearly and unambiguously the theme of Jews and Ukraine. What is certain is that it involves a rich culture with a storied history. But the subject is bedeviled by myths. You've probably heard them too. Ukraine was a haven, a paradise. No, it was a prison. It was a graveyard. Ukrainians were enemies, rotten. No, they saved my father. Jews in Ukraine were secular. No, they were pious. They were Zionists, and no, they were communists, and they were socialists. They were farmers. No, they were merchants. So one can hardly say anything without being tripped up. So I thought what I'll do is I'll just take some people and see whether or not it pans out, what they did, what they said, and we'll see the variety of intellectuals. I'll present 5 biographical vignettes that portray Jewish culture in Ukraine. So it's Ilya Galant, Lev Shestov, Simeon Ansky, Sol Baravoy, and Katya Petrovskaya. And that's my gallery. Galant advocated Ukrainian Jewish unity. Shestov was a religious philosopher. Ansky, a collector of Ukrainian Jewish folklore. Baravoy, I'm talking about his experience of Stalinist terror. And Petrovskaya, who was a contemporary writer in Germany, but grew up in Kiev. She seeks her roots in the late-Tsarist period, late Soviet period. So 3 are connected with Kiev, 1 with Odessa, and 1 in the east, Don Basin. I begin with Galant. There you go. So there's no actual picture, even in Wikipedia, of Galant. It's disappeared from existence. But here's a volume in which one of his articles appeared from 1925. He was a Ukrainian Jewish historian, and little has been written about him. He was born in Nizhyn, Ukraine in 1867 and died in Babi Yar in 1941. As a boy, he received a religious education, but then spent a lot of time at the local university library reading, moved to Kiev, taught in high schools, and then he had this amazing insight that there's a synthesis between the Jews and the Ukrainians, and they represent a single whole culture. Alone, in contrast to everyone else, Gallant depicted this Ukrainian Jewish synthesis, producing a portrait of mutual friendship, codependency, and binational unity. For Gallant, the myths of eternal hatred were just that, myths, he said. I will show in his documents that the love of Ukrainians and Jews for the land and their common struggles united them entirely. So in 1897, he wrote an article on the history of the settlement of Jews in Poland and Ukraine in general, and in Podolia in particular. Gallant made a claim that he repeated throughout his life, that Ukraine offered excellent conditions for Jewish life because, quote, it did not have that intense and sharp character as in Western Europe. He meant that the persecution of Jews that was constant and unremitting in Europe in medieval times was not the same in Ukraine. In fact, there were, of course, isolated tragedies, but for the most part, life passed by quietly, with prosperity, and in good feeling between the two peoples. Gallant writes, only ancient Rus appears a happy exception in this regard. Despite arriving at the time of the first Rurik rulers, and perhaps even earlier, Jews were not subject to personal persecution and expulsions, did not experience those physical tortures and spiritual humiliations that their co-religionists in Western Europe had to endure endlessly. Saying this, I do not believe that Jews were always blessed with total prosperity, but life passed peacefully and was not disrupted by the intrusion of the wild crowd. Gallant was aware that the most difficult question, however, for Ukrainian Jewish history was the Khmelnytsky riots, right, the 17th century. And so he didn't know what to do about it, but he said, basically, there's no evidence that the Ukrainians really hated the Jews. They were just marginal. They were just, they were fighting against the Poles, and the Jews were innocent victims of these pogroms. But it didn't interfere with the basic love between the basic existence of the Jews there, and the Jews and the Ukrainians had a lot more in common than set them apart. Okay, that's basically what he's at. And he acknowledges this, that the Jews were not the focus, however, of the Ukrainian hate. That's the main point to get. In Jewish history, tackling the subject of Ukraine is definitely complicated. To be sure, many Jewish historians of the 19th century, such as Heinrich Gretz, or Simeon Dubnov, emphasized anti-Semitism, while other Jewish historians spoke of Jews as a united community throughout the Russian Empire. Gallant embraced this Ukrainian Jewish identity, emphasizing the propitious conditions that had permitted a dynamic relationship and dynamic Jewish civilization to form and flourish. An essential assumption throughout all of Gallant's work is the concept of Ukraine that included the Jews who lived there. In this way, he was situated at a unique intersection where the birth of the national struggles in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Jewish, was announced. And the values of a multicultural, democratic Russia was growing in popularity. And the main thing is that he didn't actually believe in two peoples. No, Ukraine included the Jews in his definition. And so it wasn't like separate peoples. Their fate was joined, and the future was auspicious for both peoples. So it's really great. And I believe that Gallant would have become like a very famous person in Ukraine had it not been for that sovereignty. Ukrainian sovereignty was not long-lived, and his vision of Ukraine as a separate state with its own history was suppressed by the Soviet Union. That's really, I think, kind of sad for him in a way. He managed, however, after 1917, to be the only employee of the Jewish Historical Archaeological Commission in Ukraine. So he had like a job and income until 1929. And then he was thrown out. And until 41, we don't know what happened to him. All the documents just disappear. But we know in the denunciation letters that he was called an outlier, and for the Bolsheviks, a bourgeoisie and somebody who was not to be cared for and who was expendable. And so they removed him in general. We think that he died in Babin Yar. That was we have the one source of that, but it's a pretty reliable source, which we'll look at a little bit later, that of Saul Baravoy, who I'm going to speak about separately. Now I'm going to my next figure, Lev Shestov. Although his real name was Schwarzman, he took the pseudonym Shestov, and under that sobriquet, became known as a major philosopher of the 20th century. He was born and grew up in Kiev in a wealthy Jewish family. His father was a leading retailer of off-the-rack suits. These are these machine-made suits that put thousands of Jewish tailors out of work. You probably know them. But Shestov did not draw attention to his Jewish identity. Ukraine actually played a large role in his life because he studied philosophy at Kiev University, where there also studied two other intellectuals, Berdyaev, this is Nikolai Berdyaev, and Sergei Bulgakov. In the late imperial period, Ukraine was actually a cradle for Russian Orthodox Christian reformers and a center for the study of European philosophy. The same could not be said about Russia. It would be difficult to give a full synopsis of Shestov's thought, but I want to focus on his youthful escapades as an example of a Jewish youth with ambition and talent, two events that had a profound effect on his life and illuminate his existential thinking will be shown right here. The first tells us about a teen who, like other Jews in the region, was enamored with Marxism. To raise money for the revolutionary movement, Shestov had himself kidnapped. However, as you can imagine, his father wouldn't pay. After 40 days, he was released. Shestov wrote that he and his father never spoke about it. The second story is a little more crucial to his biography. He was visiting Switzerland, and one night he met a non-Jewish woman and immediately knew she was the one. They quickly married, and for many years he kept his marriage a secret from his parents, even when he had children. One of the central ideas of Shestov's philosophy is that creativity emerges through personal tragedy. Forced to undergo unendurable pain, such experiences transform an individual. She or he obtains spiritual insights that people under ordinary circumstances do not have. It is difficult to escape the feeling that his own unconfessable marriage and his inadvertent revelation produced by his failed ransom attempt composed tragedies, and these tragedies gave him insight into the human condition. Certainly Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy also influenced Shestov. The Bolshevik Revolution, before that, he had already moved to Western Europe, spending time in France and Switzerland, especially in the mountains where philosophers are supposed to spend their time, right? Along the Philosophenweg, where the high altitude exists and where the air is thin. This is like Shestov's language. After 1917, he never returned to Ukraine. Shestov reflects, I think, a cosmopolitan Jew in the fin de siècle, the culturally intense period at the end of the 19th century. People like him wanted to escape Jewish isolation through entrance into world culture. His was not the life of the yeshiva, but the road to modernity through the life of the mind. Many Jews took a similar path out of the ghetto. It's like a phrase from Katz, so to speak, through intellectual creativity. Despite the financial hardship of becoming a philosopher, Shestov did not show any attention to his Jewish roots. That's one thing. But he did not deny it either. In fact, in 1933, he made a trip to Eretz Israel and was a big hit among the emigres in Tel Aviv. So it's like, and he was always flirting with moving there and so on. Just okay. The next person, Shimon Ansky. You say, why? How could Shimon Ansky get into this talk? After all, he's from Belarus. Okay, good question. Shimon Ansky, his real name, Rappaport, was the famous folklorist and creator of the first Jewish museum in Eastern Europe, as well as the father of YIVO, the Institute for the Study of Eastern European Jewry, now located in New York City. Ansky's most visible connection with Ukraine is based on his famous ethnographic expeditions to the region in 1912-1914, and then his powerful Yiddish memoir about his experiences as an aid worker and civic activist during World War I. Thanks to his connections with Russian Duma, that is the parliament officials, Ansky, a leader of the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, was given permission to travel with the Russian army into various towns in Galicia, giving aid. That is, he collected money from Baron Ginsburg and delivered this money, and also spent time with the people. And it's a beautiful memoir. You should all run home and read it as soon as we finish. Today, however, I want to speak about something else. Forget all that. I want to speak about his experience in Ukraine 20 years earlier as a coal miner in the Don Basin in 1887. My presentation is a little complicated. Just follow me here. Because I want to tell you about Ansky's youth in Vitebsk, Belarus, because it is important to understand how Ukraine fits in and how Ukraine was perceived by people in the Northwest. That is, as a place for freedom and escape and so on and so forth. These are the Northwest, the Pale of Settlement, called Litvakim, the Litvak. It's not just Lithuania, it's also Belarus and comes down. This is a place of dense Jewish population. In 1910, however, Ansky published a short autobiography, Sins of My Youth, which repeated the title of a more famous autobiography by the Hebrew writer Moshe Leib Lilienblum. In his telling, Ansky describes his early adulthood when he attempted to encourage others to abandon the Jewish religion and join the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. One night, Ansky was told by a boy in Lyozno, Belarus, to run away because the rabbi and community leaders were on to him. The boy explains that he fell asleep, and the rabbi discovered between his Talmudic folios a copy of Sins of My Youth by Lilienblum. That's the book that Ansky had given the boy. Lilienblum in that book describes his loss of faith and also his nostalgia for the world that no longer is accessible to him, the world of the community and the synagogue, which led him, there's a feeling of wholeness that he has now lost being a member of the Haskalah. Okay. So Lilienblum ran from his financial problems and his social alienation to Odessa. That's what Litvakim did, right? That was a place of freedom and escape, as well as start a new life, opportunities for a secular Jewish culture. The rabbi said about Odessa, surrounded by 3 rings of hell, right? Gehenom. I mean, it was not a place for a religious person. And he found Lilienblum was invited to come. And of course, once he got there, he was disappointed, right? As any Litvak would be, right? Okay, so now we're going to Ansky. He could have gone to Odessa, but he doesn't. He splits to the east, to the Don Basin, to the mines. And there, sympathies, he is now totally revolutionary, an SR, member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. And he remembers the Socialist Revolutionaries, 1873, had this movement of go to the people, go to the Russian peasant, and propagandize revolution. What did the peasants do? they turn them all into the police. So he says the problem that all the revolutionaries have made up to this time is to think that spiritual and intellectual clarity is going up. You need to go up to the people. No, he says, let's go down into the minds. And in fact, there he finds that the people feel entirely free because the minds are the last bastion of life itself, right? And in the minds, there's no difference between brother and brother. There's Ukrainians and Belarusians and Tatars, and anyone can work in the mine. Working in the mine means a 14 to 16-hour shift, and everyone there, and nobody's professional. It's just between the sowing and the harvesting, there's some free time. People go into the mines to make a buck, and he realizes that there's no social education going on, and he begins to read to the peasants, right? This is like everyone's reading Tolstoy. He reads Tolstoy. Let's teach the peasants. But he said Tolstoy didn't get it right. You don't go up to a peasant and say, I got the Shakespeare in my hand, let's do it. No, you have to read them chapbooks and adventure novels and novels about demons and so on. And so he begins to read them, and he develops a very close relationship with them, writes a book about this, goes to St. Petersburg, becomes an editor of the journal Ruskое Bogatstvo, Russian Wealth, and then is very scared that he's going to be arrested. I guess they heard and so he goes to Paris, and he disappears for all that time. So what's the connection then to his folklore studies, right? So really there is a very close connection in this getting close to the peasant, the Russian peasant. It's only one step to find out there's also a Jewish peasant. Wow, who would have guessed, right? So he goes back after 1905 and begins to go and get in touch with and make expeditions all across the Pale of Settlement, which then develop into an actual folklore expeditions, 1912, 1914, which are, and there he has a whole group of people, including artists and musicologists and storytellers, and they're all, and he collects all kinds of folklore, not just stories and songs. Songs are a problem because, of course, no one's allowed to, these men aren't allowed to hear women sing, so he pretends to be in the other, outside the room looking in. Okay, so then all the dresses and manuscripts and clothing, everything he's collecting, and he also creates a 1,000-question questionnaire that nobody's able to fill out because it's 1,000 pages. In any case, he's like, you know, he's doing really, really great things. But that's not all. You think, okay, enough. He claimed that folklore could serve as a new Bible. This is the thing. People like me, we're not believers. But the Bible, the Tanakh, kept the Jewish people alive and united for so long. Folklore, Eastern European folklore can do that as well. That's one idea. The second idea, he says, the Jews are unique among all the people of Eastern Europe because all people, their folklore is based on militarism, on epics and bulimi and warriors. But the Jewish folklore, he says, is based on the Bible, on peace and on passivity. And he says the Jews are a unique people in Eastern Europe because they're entirely passive. And they're superior to all other people because of their love of peace. Well, you know, okay, I don't know, maybe. All this is part of a larger story about Jewish folklore in and around Ukraine that would warrant a much longer talk. Would include, I think, Mika Berdyshevsky, Yehashua Ravnitsky, Bialik. My short portrait of Ansky raises the significance of Ukraine as the embodiment of freedom for many Jews from Russia's northwest. Like others, Lillian Blum and Ansky, and that generation, they fled south to Ukraine to escape oppression, false accusations, military service, and arrest. But back to Sins of My Youth. Ansky did not regain his faith in God, but like Lillian Blum, he hankered after that feeling of wholeness that he felt among Jews. Ansky found that the feeling, that he could get that feeling in the study of Jewish folklore, just like Lillian Bloom had turned to Zionism as a kind of replacement. Remove. I turn now to Saul Baravoy, one of my favorite people, in 1903 to 1989, the historian of Ukrainian Jewry who was born and spent most of his life in Odessa. Today, I will focus on a small part of his career, the decade between his return to Odessa after World War II and his second return after hiding in Moscow during the height of the Doctors' Plot. That is the campaign that threatened Jewish survival in the Soviet Union in the first half of 1953. Baravoy's scholarly career can be broken into two parts: publications about Jewish things up to 1940, and then when he was prevented from publishing on, and to some extent even studying Jewish history. He left a memoir published posthumously in 1989 that offers a fascinating window onto the life of a Jewish historian in the Soviet Union. A word about Baravoy. I said he was born in Odessa before the 1917 revolution, and his parents were were Zionists and supporters of the Moria publishing house, and they knew Bialik and Ravnitsky, and they had him over all the time, and Saul Chernichovsky, and so on and so forth. In the university, he became enamored with the work of Dubnov, and so he wanted to become a Jewish historian himself. He wrote two books on the Ukrainian Jews before the study was outlawed. One is called Jewish Chronicles of the 17th Century, the Epoch of Khmelnytsky, and the second one, Jewish Agricultural Colonization in Old Russia, Politics, Economics, Everyday Life. Okay, we're getting there. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Baravoy's academy got the faculty together, and they evacuated to Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Although he regretted leaving his father behind, he and his wife left. They returned to Odessa 3 years later, in 1944, discovering that his father was killed and the city in ruins. Baravoy turned to the study of the Holocaust. It's like, the Holocaust just happened, let's do it. Focusing especially on the experience of Odessa's Jews. He wrote an article for inclusion in the justly famous Black Book of Nazi Crimes, edited by Vasily Grossman. However, due to a mix-up, his article was not published and was only published in 1992 posthumously. He carried out, nonetheless, at this time, important detective work. He sort of unmasked perpetrators, local collaborators, paying tribute to partisans and ordinary people who saved Jews. Baravoy verified many stories of heroism depicting individuals who risked their lives in the struggle against the Romanian army. In his memoir, Baravoy describes his own life during the post-war decade using the same kind of moral voice. He describes arriving home at the same time as the government celebrated the 150th anniversary of the city of Odessa. He recounts that he played a big role too. He just published an article on the city's history. However, his optimism turns to disappointment when he could not return to his apartment because it was occupied by others. Additionally, although an academic, which is the highest rank of professor in the Soviet Union, he was unemployed. After the war, everyone had to find a new job. He immediately, he noticed there was public demonstrations of anti-Semitism, and instead of sympathy, he discovered resentment and hate. He writes, "I am in Odessa once again. I examined the character of my native city. There was a great deal that was new, hard to get used to, with which it was impossible to reconcile. On the gates of many buildings, one could see crosses painted. That meant that the building was free of Jews. Even a year after the liberation, one could still see it. Sometimes, and for a long time, one could hear from behind, 'The vermin have returned.' The word vermin, in the mouth of an Odessite who had successfully come through the occupation, acquired a distinctly ethnic content. He continues, I paid attention to what my non-Jewish friends and acquaintances said about the occupation. It was hard to hold back when they told me it wasn't so bad under the Romanians, that they weren't Germans, they were humane and cultured. In short, you can live with them. When I presented arguments like, but how did they treat Jews? Then suddenly our mutual understanding snapped. An abyss between us appeared. Although he doesn't acknowledge it, the reader realizes that something essential has changed, that basically all of his friends and family have disappeared, right, or have been killed. An optimist, Baravoy also sensed opportunities. He found employment with the Credit Economic Institute. He recounts a dream, the dream of reviving his scholarly career and especially studying Jewish history. In this context, Odessa's anniversary gave him hope, since one cannot study the history of the city without its Jewish contribution. But alas, they could, he says. The Jews were left out of the project. Nonetheless, he engaged in research on the city's history and managed, even at this time, to write a book about Odessa's Jews. And here's the story of that book. So he turned it in to this publishing house, MS, which has only published Yiddish works at the time. And he thought, but nonetheless, they'll publish this history of Odessa's Jews. And then he had a dream that something bad would happen, and he called them and asked them to remove it. 2 days later, the publishing house, to send it back, which they did. 2 days later, the publishing house was closed and all the employees arrested. So, and then, of course, things worsened in 1953. And Baravoy writes, on January 13th, 1953, the report about the doctor murderers was published. I am not a doctor and not a murderer, but it was immediately clear to me that all this cannot fail to influence my fate. In February 1953, Baravoy was forced to resign his position temporarily from the Commercial Institute. He was visited by agents who checked out his apartment and we were disappointed to find a one-bedroom with a leaky ceiling, he writes. Nonetheless, knowing what's going on, he took off, fled to Moscow, hiding out. And because in Odessa, he was already not persona non grata, and he says, that I heard what was going on in Odessa. A certain Gerashenka, a city administrator, told someone, Baravoy is especially unlucky. After all, the same day that our meeting about him occurred, a bomb exploded at the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv. Baravoy comments that he didn't see the connection between the meeting and the bomb in Tel Aviv, after all. Suddenly, Stalin died, and within a few weeks, Baravoy felt safe enough to return back to Odessa. However, he had a big problem. An article came out about him, June 15th, 1953, entitled Bourgeois Nationalist Under a Scholar's Mask. How's he going to get a job now, right? So, with threats swirling around, Baravoy made an appointment to see the Obkom, local communist secretary, Vladimir Gut. Gut explained that the country was fighting an intense civil war, class war, and enemies could be identified. The doctors, certainly, but also the Joint, the American Jewish Agency. Although not in any immediate political trouble, he would have to find some employment or leave the city. He found support in a certain Anna Pankrotova, an important personage with a lot of contacts. This is a woman who came from a poor background, but had risen up through the educational ranks and was a strong communist. And she kept saying, come on, you guys, you got to help this guy out, right? So they said that while she defended Baravoy and asked the Obkom leaders to help him, they said Baravoy has a brother in Israel and recalled his untrustworthy writings. Nonetheless, her support led to a meeting at the Obkom and ultimately Baravoy's re-employment, you can clap or so, at the Credit Economic Institute, which caused the former head of the Obkom, Gut, to write, "We worked so hard to get rid of Baravoy, and once again you promote him?" Sounds like my career at Tulane. Sorry about that. In the memoir, Baravoy generalizes about his long life in Odessa. He died in 1989 this way. Nonetheless, I have been happy in my life. I survived the difficult years of revolution, civil war, hunger, and epidemics. I was not repressed in the early 50s, and that was a happy coincidence. The most serious illnesses passed me by. I was able to spend my life engaged with my favorite subject. I was lucky to meet many good people and smart people. And Berkeley explains his, or attributes his longevity in part to his refusal to join the Communist Party during the purges. And he had to acknowledge his share of good luck. But this is probably the real reason, in part. One of the reasons is that he never betrayed the Soviet Union and always considered himself a loyal member of that country. And so he survived. Last but not least, Katya Petrovskaya. Maybe you know her brother. You probably know her brother. Everyone does, yeah. My last video is dedicated to transnationalism and nostalgia. Katya Petrovskaya, born in 1970, a native of Kiev in the late Soviet, early independence period. In her book, Maybe Esther, 2014, she describes her search for self in a series of fragments organized around her relatives, grandparents, uncles and aunts, the history. And the book is a portrait of the Jewish intelligentsia at the end of the Soviet Union. Born and having lived most of her life, I said in Kiev, she grew up in a family of teachers. Her mother was a high school teacher and her father was a professor of literature. During the 1990s, Petrovskaya fell in love with a German and moved to Berlin. At the same time, her brother learned Hebrew and turned to Orthodox Jewry. He is now a professor at Northwestern, the United States. This book, to this date, her only one, was written in German. Katya explains her mission to present the history of the 20th century, nothing less. I had thought that telling the story of the few people who happened to be my relatives was all that was needed to conjure up the entire 20th century. My family had just about everything. I had arrogantly thought: a farmer, any number of teachers, a provocateur, a physicist, and a poet, and plenty of legends. We had a revolutionary who joined the Bolsheviks, a physicist who ran an experiment with in a turbine factory in Kharkiv and vanished during the purges. Her brother-in-law was told to turn against him in court because party loyalty was gauged by a person's willingness to sacrifice his own family members. We had a war hero named Gertrude, the husband of my Aunt Lida, who was born when work was declared an end in itself. At first, everyone worked a lot, then too much, and later still more, because exemplary achievement replaced norms and work became the meaning of life in a nation of proletariats and supermen. And so it came about that my future uncle was named Geroi Truda, which means in English, hero of labor, work hero, abbreviated to Gertrude. It's cute, yeah. On one level, the book exudes a kind of Jewish feel, the genre of discovery of families broken apart due to history, the Holocaust, the revolution, Stalinist purges. On another level, this quest for roots is universal. Perhaps every person in this room has clicked Ancestry.com or another such site once in a while. But Petrovskaya's story is also quintessentially Ukrainian. Her investigations begin and end in Kiev. Although in between, she travels to Poland, Germany, Austria in search of information. Her Kiev is nonetheless not the closed city that you might expect from the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain. As we might imagine it, Petrovskaya's Kiev is a satellite in the bigger Eastern European universe. So in the east, there's Moscow and St. Petersburg. To the west, there's Warsaw, Krakow, Prague, Berlin. So her Kiev is part of this world, which is it's kind of interesting in a way. Ukraine is Europe, says Petrovskaya, but she also wants to transmit the feel of its Marxist past. At one time, perhaps, Soviet ideology mattered, but in her life, only the obscure names of streets remain. She recalls her childhood, quote, "My life began at the intersection of two streets with German names, Engels and Leibniz. My parents came into this world on these two streets. My father on Ulica Engelsa, and my mother on Ulica Leibniz, at the corner of Institutskaya. And my school was at this intersection as well. If there is something to blame in the sense that everything happens for a reason, then it is this German intersection. Its sounds were entrenched in my brain as I walked to school. Certainly, this is an allusion to her present life in Germany. But at the same time, you have to sort of wonder about the meaningless now of these names, right? Who are these radicals, Friedrich Engels and Karl Liebknecht? And what about this teen who goes to dance lessons on Monday and Wednesday and to choir practice on Tuesday and Thursday at the name of these former important radicals who mean nothing anymore, right? It's basically. So the late Soviet Ukraine has to be viewed, I think, like this, that it's this balloon full of air, which is the ideology, which is now all let out, and all you have in your hand is that flimsy plastic rubber, right? So that's my image. The book features the late Soviet intertextual erudition. So Katya's a kind of Tartu, a product of Tartu, so all the time she mentions Greek myths, classics of world literature, any number of obscure Russian writers, even with a PhD you've never heard of. And you have to know that the late Soviet period, people thought of themselves as a reservoir of world literature. They sort of believed that they were resurrecting all of the past in their brains, probably as an excuse to spend time and to do something meaningful at a time when there wasn't that much meaningful to do, and also to escape long lines at the stores, let someone else go, and you're too busy memorizing in poems in Latin and Russian and German and Ukrainian and so on. That's my impression. In her searches to exhume her family's past, she confronts Eastern Europe of the 20th century, and that means trips to the archives of concentration camps, the KGB headquarters. She tunes her antennae for information, telling a heartwarming story of her aunt and uncle who dedicated themselves to their school for the deaf and won accolades throughout Europe for their innovations in teaching lip reading. Another of her relatives, a man named Stern, assassinated a high-ranking German official in 1932, which led to a major show trial in Moscow. What Stern was trying to achieve, she says, is to show that human beings are not just cogs in the machine, but have freedom, even the freedom just to shoot someone they feel like. So she says, and not every action can be corralled for the benefit of the collective. Her relatives are brought to life through her searches, but to what end? The book celebrates the drive to connect with the past, suggesting that the act of memory deepens our present. But one is left with questions. Why is the past so important? What does the late Soviet period signify? What is it about that period of mockery and dissatisfaction that makes us feel nostalgic for its ideological hypocrisy and geopolitical boredom? Against the present, perhaps that era just before Glasnost was a heyday of peace, stability, and security before the avalanche of disaster, Putin and Putinism. One paragraph left for all those who are already tired of me. That always gets good. Another thing worth noting, and I'll finish with this, is that transnationalism is an essential feature of 20th century Jews in Ukraine. The ordinary bookends of life, birth date, place of birth, death date, place of death, are far from one another. Isaac Babel, Odessa, Moscow. Shmuel Agnon, Buchach and Jerusalem. Paul Celan, Chernowitz and Paris. Most of Ukraine's greatest Jews died far from Ukraine. The rare exception is Bruno Schultz, who died in his hometown of Drohobych. Is that right? Drohobych. In the 20th century, Ukraine exported itself, if involuntarily, to the world. Though many paid a great price, there are positive ramifications. For us, despite the physical distance, Ukraine is with us. It accompanied Mark von Hagen for his life. Ukraine Jews have given a great deal to American Jewish culture, and that's because it has what to give.
Thank you, Professor Horowitz. We're going to start with questions from the audience, and then if you're online with us, please put your questions or comments in the Q&A section of your screen. So go ahead, Professor Diner.
Thanks so much. That was a lot that I didn't know. But to be honest, I would have chosen Sholem Aleichem, the Baal Shem Tov. So I'm just wondering, so how did you, what weaves these all together? How did you choose these particular figures and overarching idea behind all this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First, I knew you were going to speak about rabbis. I felt like that would be taken care of, but that's a kind of a joke. But the Yiddish writers that you mentioned, Mendele Mokasforim, absolutely need to be in this. I had another part. I mean, I felt like these five are kind of random, but they were ones that I know from having written about them. And but you could replace them with 5 other or 10 other people. Moshe Milansky, a first Aliyah figure, wrote a book about Ukraine's fields being like Palestine's fields. There's just so much. It's so rich. There's so many people. Invite me again, and I'll do one on the Mendele Mokasforim and Shalom Aleichem. But Shalom Aleichem would be actually a great topic. It's true. Mea culpa.
You know, it's an interesting question to what extent Shestov is really a Jewish philosopher. Most people are not even aware that he was Jewish. So maybe you can explore that. What is Jewish about his philosophy?
He relied to a great extent on the Bible and the Adam and Eve story about human volition in the face of evil, for instance. There's a Wisconsin professor who did many articles about Shestov as a Jewish philosopher. But the other side is that in the emigration, he was somewhat involved with Jewish figures. My dissertation figure Gershon Zon. But you're right that he was mainly a Russian. But I wanted to show that there were many Jews who joined the Russian culture and lost themselves in it.
Okay, let's listen to other questions from the audience. Yes, go ahead, Camille. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to a little bit follow up on the Glenn's question and ask you kind of controversially, what unites all these people besides the place, which is Ukraine, and even make it more problematic that some of the place in Ukraine, because of embeddedness in the Russian imperial context and also in cultural nationalism, could be interpreted and were by many Jews, including as a places of Russian culture. Odessa is one of the examples that, you wrote the book about Jabotinsky Russian years that are mostly happening in Odessa. And now Jabotinsky is very original that he is one of the first of the Jewish thinkers who appreciates and understands the reason of Ukrainian nationalism. But his, kultur is the Ruskaya kultura. And for many, thousands of Odessan Jews also, Odessa was the place of interaction of the Jewishness with the Russian culture, including, all these para-colonial narratives regarding Ukrainian peasants, etc., etc. So it's just, throwing the stone into the garden and asking what's really connecting all these people besides the place, which could be interpreted in a very different way. And some of these places in Ukraine could be interpreted as spaces of Russian culture, actually, and of Russian Jewish identity. Yeah. So.
No, that's very get closer. Yeah, answer.
Oh. So there were many of the people that I studied in Odessa belong to Russian culture, and but there's also a very strong Jewish culture that would be out of could not be properly put in any category, like the Ahada'am and Bialik. What would you say? They're not Ukrainians. They're not really Russian culture. And there's no Jewish national discourse. So that was really my point, is that the people, that Ukraine offered this amazing variety, but amazing place where people could pursue different linguistic and cultural opportunities and make their own personal choice of which place they wanted to belong to. But it wasn't like being in Ukraine didn't mean that you could. I mean, I know that Petrovsky Stern he talks about people who made a choice to become Ukrainian, and that is a good. That's for them. But there were many people who did not buck the trend. That is, even though they lived in Ukraine, they adopted as their cultural magnet the power society, the power culture, right? For them, that meant Russian, or the other side would be German, right? In the West, Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming here. I mean, that's a really hard question to follow, but I'll try. So I'm really interested by what you said near the end of your lecture about how all these Ukrainian raised Jewish intellectuals lived and died abroad. So in a way, like Ukraine had exported itself. So I'm wondering, what do you mean by like Ukraine exporting itself? Does it mean that Ukraine exists like as like quite like a literal place, or is it like more of like a concept, like an idea of like expression?
Shalom Aleichem is good because he came to the United States and he had an audience here, and in general there was creation as the Jewish people moved in different places and became an audience. There was an audience around the world for the Ukrainian culture. But yes, very much an idea. But I don't think maybe Ukraine is too problematic a concept to say that they exported Ukraine. What is Ukraine, in my interpretation, is almost a sieve. It's many things at once, and it allows for enormous amounts of freedom depending on where you stood vis-a-vis the Russian culture, where you stood vis-a-vis the Ukrainian culture. Ilya Galant, for him, Ukraine would have become a sovereign country, and he was going to be the national historian of the Ukrainian Jews. And that didn't work out for him, right? So it also depended on where you came from. So if you're from Zhytomyr, you're going to be, or Kharkiv, you're going to have a more Ukrainian-centered worldview, if you want to call it that. So it really did depend on where you were. But I'm thinking about, and then the other thing is that I think Professor Diener might agree that someone like Eichenbaum, the poet, not the literary critic, but that you maybe from the north and then you go south because you get a job in Zhytomyr at the rabbinical seminary. Does that make you Ukrainian? But it's in Ukraine. It's the southern school, or the editor of Rasviet, the newspaper, who was actually from Odessa. But that's also a Russified kind of intellectual, but with what's called the Southern School of Jewish Literature. So I'm not sure. These people's names always escape me. But in the main point I'm trying to make is that in some ways you could also split this and say that the Jewish world was beyond just Ukraine, and was a single whole, as David Roskies would argue, Jewish lands, that whole area where there's dense Jewish population, and that would erase in a way this Ukrainian separate category. So what do I think? I think for many people, Ukraine really does matter as a concept and as a geographic space, but not for everybody. And people were definitely mobile and moving around and could change their identities pretty quickly. But it was more likely, and it's just as likely that some people would go to St. Petersburg as Odessa. It's like when you had a choice, if you had a university degree, you were probably going to go to St. Petersburg. If you didn't have a university degree or going to get one, you went south, right? If you were a Jewish nationalist, you're more likely to go south or to go to Warsaw. And so these are all the choices that people make based on the conditions or the challenges that they face.
Well, I'm going to pose two questions. One is, you told us a story about individuals who chose certain path. I would like to know more about institutions, Jewish institutions in the Ukraine. That's question number one. Question number two, Ukraine Uman is in the Ukraine, and Jews in hundreds and thousands of them come to visit the grave of Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw. And can you tell us more about Hasidism in the Ukraine?
I just saw since I get this a movie site called Chai-Flix, which is and there was this one about how more and more of the pilgrims to Uman are actually becoming interested in the Holocaust as well, and making sites in Ukraine and in Poland, which was surprising for me to find out that even in Hasidut, there's the people who are religious go to visit their Rebbe, the Rebbe's grave, Nachman of Wroclaw, and they get inspiration there, and they go as a group. But it's really quite interesting that it's become huge numbers as you see, as this part of Israeli society, and I would say also the United States, Brooklyn, New York, are inspired and are make the trip, right, to become energized and re-energized through touching the grave site, through leaving their notes, through prayer there. So it's a good business for everybody involved, but I think it shows in a sense, you don't want to think this, but it shows in a sense a re-estimation of the diaspora, right? And the importance of diaspora in the Jewish world and in creativity, in helping ignite the creativity in the religious Jewish world. So it's not without a lot of meaning. Is that something that makes sense? No. Oh, anyway, and then what was the first question?
Institutions.
Institutions. I mean, you could speak about 1918 to 1920, autonomous, that autonomous Ukrainian government had its own Department of Jewish Affairs with its own leaders, and so there was an opportunity for a real synthesis and unity and understanding that Jews are part of Ukraine, and that this future Ukraine as a sovereign country is going to really rely on its Jewish members as well. What's kind of interesting is, though I know a little tiny bit about this, that in the parliament, even though there were many language purists there, some people demanded that Jews use the word Žid as for Jew, which is in Russian has a negative connotation, but they argued that in Ukraine does not have that, and maybe it does not. So, but they agreed during the parliament sessions, for the sake of their sensitivities of their Jewish brothers and sisters, they would use Yevrei, right, which Israelite instead of Jew. That's kind of an interesting fact. The other institutions of Ukraine are just the Society for the Promotion of Enlightenment Among the Jews of Russia, which I wrote a book, has had a very important Odessa branch, in which it was the place where the Jewish intelligentsia began to take on some of the characteristics of the Stadtland, of the leadership, and that is even holding democratic elections to the board, deciding what courses should be in their schools, creating model schools, creating modern Heder education. So that was pretty interesting, as well as the Jewish newspapers, right, in Odessa. So
we are going to go now to questions from our audience online. Lisa, please read us some questions.
Great, thank you. This question is from David Cater, and he is asking, what place has Zionism in its various manifestations in the lives of the Ukrainian Jewish persons highlighted in this talk? And he also wants you to reflect on Jabotinsky a little bit, since you wrote the book.
Right. In the talk, not so much. I was trying to exactly find people who felt grounded in Ukraine, even if they were attracted or embodying Russian culture, that they did not see themselves as moving. But Odessa was a center of Zionist thought. The most famous early Zionists come from there. Ahad Ha'am I already mentioned, but The mayor of Tel Aviv, Dizengoff, came from Odessa. And there was meetings of this Odessa group in the Society of Promotion of Enlightenment, as well as the books in the Moriah Publishing House. Jabotinsky is really great because, in contrast to Ravnitsky and to these, what I call, yeshiva bocherim who came to Zionism through a religious education, Jabotinsky was really maybe the first who didn't have a religious education and was almost totally Russified. There's arguments with Hillel Halkin about this, but I'm on the side of the anti-Halkinists. But so he found himself realizing that the national question is going to be the most important one. And as a Jew, what is he going to do? He likes Shakespeare, but I'm born Jewish. I better learn Hebrew and start getting into the Jewish political world. And that explains his realization that in a post-Duma, 1905, post-Duma, a sort of semi-democratic Russia, if you want to win elections as a Jew, you're not going to have a chance. You need to find alliances with others. And the ones you're most likely in that area, he ran from Rovno, did not win, is with Ukrainians. If you can find a common ground with them. And then his main point, there's two other main points. The main point, though, is that he realized, and he argued in a major article, that Russians are not the majority in their own country. They include the Ukrainians, but without the Ukrainians, they're like 49%. And so if the Jews and the Ukrainians and other subalterns were to join together, they could actually win these elections. Whether that would be effective in any way is unclear, but a lot of people had hopes about national autonomy and a new overthrowing Tsarism, or at least reforming the Tsarist government.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have a few. The next one is from Bonnie Cluins, I think is how it's pronounced. And she is reflecting on her family's experience in the Ukraine, and which was violent and, and the people you talked about, you didn't really talk about a lot of hardship that they went through. So she's asking, are these utopian philosophers, or did they experience the same hardships that everyone else and, decide to stay?
Well, I did mention that Paravoy was almost, repressed. But I did side sweep the pogroms that we're going to hear about tomorrow from 1918 to 1921, terrible violence. And also during World War I, there was terrible violence as well. I mentioned Ansky was a witness to that and wrote about the violence in Ukraine. So, but yes, I spared you today.
Okay. All right. The last question is from one of our professors who's not with us, who's online with us today, Professor Madeline Adelman. And she says, thank you for your enriching talk. Would you please comment on the extent to which all or any of your selected intellectuals are considered today by scholars of Ukraine or various movement thinkers as their own, as they studied in departments of history, etc.?
Yes, I think that Ilya Galant, after I wrote my article, I got it. There was another person, I forget her name, she's at Stanford now, and she wrote a nasty article saying how important Galant is and how he must be more thoroughly integrated into Ukrainian Jewish history. And it was a nice piece, anyway. And then Baravoy is also an important figure. It's a field that's, I think, understudied. So maybe my colleague who asked the question could also get into it, because there's a lot of Jewish historians that need greater study. But so I think that, and Ansky is just a worldwide known figure entirely. So I didn't choose, entirely, with the exception of Katya Petrovskaya, who's a friend. I didn't, find the dregs. But I didn't find, people who aren't well known and famous in Jewish history, I believe.
Yeah, the last two questions were about diaspora nationalism in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Diaspora nationalism in Ukraine. Yeah, I think that has there was at the time before the Holocaust real hope, from Dubinov's writings on, that the Jews could have either territorial autonomy or some kind of personal autonomy within these other cultures, and that, as you know, from the World War I peace treaty, there was national rights were instituted throughout Eastern Europe for the most part. But so in general, there were opportunities, there were thoughts, there were people who cared a great deal about this and thought there was it could be a success with the right amount of help. I do want to mention in this one moment the remember the role, not the joint, the Jewish agriculture, the Общество труда. What's the Общество? What? No, that's not the health people. The work one. What? ORT, who gave lots of money to Jewish during this early Soviet period, who helped fund Jewish agricultural settlements in the Crimea and in Ukraine generally. And one of their ideas was to give equal amounts to non-Jews in the neighboring farms and holdings in order not to create jealousy. So that was like an idea that Ort had, but it went through Soviet hands, and the money didn't always reach where it was supposed to, and the hopes were perhaps overblown in contrast to the achievements of these collective farms. But in general, I don't think it's wrong to think that the way people often focus or fixate on Israel and its experiments there were unique. No, they were happening in other places as well, in Ukraine, but also in the United States. It's collective Jewish farms.
Brian, if you could just maybe comment on the Jewish community in Ukraine now, and you talked about the political situation and how Ukraine could have a Jewish president and what that might say about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. I know it's somewhat of a far-reaching question, but
Ukraine, I think it was 2007. I had a Fulbright for half a year, and there at that time there was a big debate. I'm going back. There was a big debate on whether we should train young people for life in Ukraine or whether we should accept that most of them will leave for Israel. So, and why should we put so much money and so much effort into them if they're leaving anyway? Was one of the problems. So that these civic activists faced, even though with American aid. So I think that's somewhat similar today. I know there's that Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern probably wouldn't agree with me, but I don't know. I'm not sure that the fight that's going on now, with the exception of Zelensky, is really a Jewish fight. I think that most of the Jews are somewhere else, but I know that there are Jews who live in Ukraine. I'm glad to see that there's a different view that has taken hold, that Ukraine is not a place of hate and of animosity, thank you, but rather a place that represents democratic and liberalism and is fighting for its life as a small country against a much larger adversary. So, but I don't really, I think the world moved on. I'm a little bit into this Dubnovian idea of transferring centers or movable centers. I think the centers are now in the United States, in Eretz Israel, or in Israel, I should say. There's some people in France, apparently, and in Western Europe and so on, but for the most part, but Zelensky has shown this kind of Jewish heroism. Pretty impressive, right? Yeah, I know. Does it contradict what I'm saying? maybe, but maybe the bigger scheme, there's more, we'll wait to see. It's still unfolding, but it is, it was heartwarming. And let me see, there was a, there's a silly view. You remember the historian, like with Jews, that countries that shed its Jews will fall, like this ridiculous, I forget the guy's name. Anyway, so Ukraine is being welcoming to Jews, and you see all the Jews of Russia leaving. Maybe that's a sign of some hopefulness. So let's hope.
All right, so thank you so much, Professor Horowitz. And before we are going to clap for that, I want to remind our audience, especially our audience online, that our next activity would be on October 30th. That's a Monday. Professor Peskin, Victor Peskin from ASU, is going to face the challenging situation that we have in Israel right now. And his talk is going to be, why have peace efforts failed so far? Kind of the history of the attempts to find peaceful way to resolve the tension between Israel and the Palestinians. So please tune up, right? Whatever, zoom in. And that's at 6 o'clock on October 30th. So now let's all join me and thank Professor Horowitz for this wonderful lecture.